Ethan Cole bought what he thought was an abandoned ghost town for $100. But the moment he rode in, something was wrong. Smoke curled from a chimney that shouldn't have worked in years. A neat garden grew in a patch where only weeds should have taken root. And through a cracked window, a shadow moved across a room that had supposedly been empty for decades. The deed in his pocket said he owned every building, every plot, every splintered beam of this forgotten place. But the woman standing in the doorway of the old general store, her weathered hands gripping a rifle, made it clear his paperwork might not mean much here. Ethan swung down from his horse, the dust swirling around his boots. The morning sun cast long shadows between leaning buildings, and beneath the quiet wind, he heard something unexpected. Voices. A cough. Not the dry sound of dust, but the wet, rattling kind that carried from deep inside one of the structures. He walked toward the store slowly, hands where she could see them. She didn't lower the rifle. Her eyes had the kind of hard focus a person gets from guarding something precious against impossible odds. "Ma'am," he said, stopping short of the porch. "I think there might be some confusion here." "No confusion on my end," the woman replied. Her voice was steady, but her fingers were tight on the stock. "You're the one who doesn't belong." Behind her, through the open door, Ethan caught a glimpse of blankets hung up as dividers, shelves lined with canned food, and a small fire burning in the corner where dry goods used to be displayed. This wasn't a campsite. It was a home. "I've got the deed," Ethan said, patting his jacket. "Bought the whole town from the county. Legal and proper." Her laugh was short and bitter. "Legal and proper. That's what they said when they took my husband's farm. Legal and proper when they locked us out of our own house. Legal and proper when they left us with nowhere to go but here." The cough came again from inside, violent, tearing. The woman's composure cracked for half a second before she steadied herself. "That's my granddaughter. She's sick. This is the only roof we've got for 100 miles. Something twisted in Ethan's chest. He'd expected broken roofs and empty streets. Maybe some old boards to clear before figuring out what he could turn the place into. He hadn't expected people. He sure hadn't expected a sick child. "How long you been here?" he asked. 3 months. Since the bank took everything else. The coughing inside grew worse. She kept her rifle ready. Not aimed, but always ready. "She needs medicine," the woman said softly. "And a roof that doesn't leak when it rains." Ethan glanced around at the buildings he now legally owned. Half had caved-in roofs. Others leaned like they'd collapse in the next good wind. But here in the old store, someone had carved out a piece of safety. He was about to answer when something inside crashed to the floor. The woman dropped her rifle without hesitation and ran in. Ethan followed. The store's interior had been transformed into a mix of home and sickroom. Wooden crates served as furniture, cloth strips for privacy. In the corner, on a bed made of blankets and old boards, lay a girl so thin it made his stomach ache. She couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds. Pale skin, dark circles under her eyes, every cough shaking her whole frame. "Grandma," the girl whispered. The woman, Linda, as Ethan would learn later, knelt and pressed a hand to the girl's forehead. Her tenderness hit Ethan harder than a drawn gun. "Fever's worse," Linda murmured. "She needs a doctor," she told him. "Real medicine. Nearest doctor's in Milford," Ethan said. 2-day ride. "I know where it is," she snapped. "You think I haven't thought of that? I had a wagon, horses, money. The bank took it all. Said my husband signed a loan he never signed." The girl coughed again, deep and wet. "How much to let us stay till spring?" Linda asked suddenly. "I'll work, cook, clean, and clothes. Anything." Ethan felt the deed in his pocket like it weighed 50 pounds. He had the right to tell them to leave. But looking at the girl's fevered face, the law felt like a cold blade he didn't want to touch. Before he could speak, the sound of horses broke the moment. More than one. Moving fast. Linda went rigid. "They found us." 3 riders came in like they owned the place. The leader was a thin man with cold eyes and a badge catching the sun. Sheriff Mason Crow. Sheriff Mason Crow swung down from his horse like he had all the time in the world, though his eyes said otherwise. 2 deputies flanked him, their smirks carrying the kind of cruelty that came from enjoying other people's fear. Crow's gaze slid from Ethan to the thin ribbon of smoke curling out of the store's chimney, then to the small garden out front. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Well, he said, drawing out each word. Linda Whitmore, you've led us on quite a chase. Linda stepped in the doorway, blocking his view inside. Her shoulders were squared, but Ethan could see her hands tremble. We're not trespassing, Mason, she said, voice tight. This land belongs to someone else now. That's Sheriff Crow to you, he corrected, his eyes cutting to Ethan. And you be the fool who bought this worthless pile of dirt from the county. Ethan didn't like the way the man said fool, but kept his voice even. I have legal ownership. The deed's clear. Crow chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Legal ownership? That's rich. Did they tell you you bought land with debts attached? Linda's face went pale. She owes $800, Crow went on. Unpaid loans and penalties. Bank's been patient. Patience is gone. They're forged, Linda said, stepping forward. My husband never. Your dead husband can't testify. Crow cut in, his voice smooth as oil. His signature's on file. Debt stands. 800. Ethan knew that was more money than most folks here saw in 5 years. More than he'd paid for the whole town. She doesn't have 800, Ethan said flatly. No, Crow agreed, which is why she's coming with us. The bank has other ways of settling debts. One deputy stepped forward, hand resting on his revolver. Ma'am, best come quiet now. Inside the store, the girl's cough tore through the air, sharp, wet, desperate. Linda's knuckles whitened around the doorframe. She can't travel. She's sick. Should have thought about that before you ran, Crow said. The child comes too. Bank always recovers its investments. Ethan felt a slow burn start in his chest. He'd seen what happened to women and children dragged off by men like these. It didn't take imagination. It was just ugly truth. What kind of work? He asked, his voice low. Crow's smile was the kind a man wears when he's about to ruin something and enjoy it. The kind that clears debts fast. Linda's voice cracked. Please, she's just a child. Can't you see she's sick? The deputies started forward. That's when Ethan moved, stepping between them and Linda, his hand resting on his gun. The lady said no. The air went still. Crow studied him, noting the worn gun belt, the steady eyes, and that Ethan wasn't bluffing. You don't want to get mixed up in this, Crow warned, his voice shifting to something colder. Too late, Ethan said. They're on my land. That makes it my business. One deputy hesitated. Sheriff, maybe we should. Shut up, Collins, Crow snapped, never looking away from Ethan. You have any idea what you're interfering with? Why don't you tell me? Ethan said. Crow's hand hovered near his pistol. Step aside. Show me the papers, Ethan replied. Crow blinked. What? The loan documents. Signatures. If this debt's real, prove it. For a second, something flickered across Crow's face. Then it was gone. I don't have to prove anything to you. Then you're not taking them. Deputy Collins shifted his feet like he wanted to be anywhere but there. Crow's jaw worked. Finally, he said, fine, we'll ride to Milford, get the bank president to bring all the papers you want. But that means waiting till tomorrow. And I'll be bringing a federal marshal. When he sees you blocking the law, you'll be the one in chains. It was bait, a way out for Ethan. Step aside, and it wouldn't be his problem anymore. But inside, the girl's cough rattled again, weak and raw. Ethan realized his choice had been made the moment he saw Linda standing in that doorway, rifle in hand and fear in her eyes. Bring your marshal, he said. Bring whoever you want. Crow's smile returned, but it was the kind that belonged to a man already planning where to bury you. The sound of Crow's horses faded into the distance, leaving a heavy quiet over the town. Linda stood in the doorway, her hand still on the frame, as if it was the only thing holding her up. When she finally looked at Ethan, her eyes carried more questions than she could ask. Why? She said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Why risk yourself for strangers? Ethan didn't have a clean answer. Maybe it was the thin girl on that bed, coughing her lungs raw. Maybe it was the way Linda had offered to work for her keep instead of begging. Or maybe he was just tired of watching people like Crow grind down people who couldn't fight back. Instead of answering, he asked, tell me about the loan. She was quiet for a long moment, eyes fixed on the road Crow had taken. Then she said, "My husband, Tom, never borrowed money from anyone. Wouldn't even buy on credit at the store. Said debt was just a chain with a smile. After he died, the bank showed up with papers, signatures I'd never seen. Said he owed them for land improvements, equipment, things we never bought. When I tried to fight it, they told me women couldn't contest their husbands' obligations." Ethan had seen this before. Banks and lawmen working together like wolves, making sure the sheep had nowhere to run. "Grandma," a small voice called from inside. Linda turned, and Ethan followed her back to the girl. She was propped up against a stack of blankets, sweat shining on her pale skin. When she tried to sit forward, she didn't have the strength. "I'm thirsty," she whispered. Linda reached for a bucket by the bed, but the bottom was nearly dry. "Well's out back," she told Ethan. "Still works if you draw deep enough." Ethan took the bucket and stepped outside. The well was old, it was gray with years of sun, but the rope came back up dripping with clean water. As he filled the bucket, he thought about the $800. He had it, saved from cattle sales, tucked away for the kind of trouble a man hopes never comes. He could hand it over and end this right now. But that meant giving Crow and the bank exactly what they wanted. Proof their forged debts could make them rich. And once they got paid, they'd just move on to the next family. When he carried the water back inside, Linda was sitting beside her granddaughter, smoothing the girl's hair back from her forehead. Her touch was light, but her eyes were heavy with worry. "She needs medicine," Linda said without looking up. "Real medicine. And soon." "That doctor in Milford?" Ethan asked. Her eyes met his. "If we go there, we won't come back. Crow has friends. Too many." Ethan thought about their options. They could run, but the girl wouldn't survive the trip. They could hide, but Crow knew exactly where they were now. They could fight, but shooting deputies, even corrupt ones, would bring the law down harder than any of them could handle. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "What kind of way?" Linda asked, studying his face. Before he could answer, the sound came, hoofbeats, many of them from the east. They stepped to the window. Dust rose in the distance, a wide cloud that meant a lot of riders moving fast. These weren't Crow's men. No badges, no uniforms, but they carried rifles and the kind of set jaws that came from people who'd stopped running. The riders swept into town and reined up in the main street. Their leader was a woman about Linda's age, her hair tied back, her eyes sharp. She dismounted and called out, "Linda Whitmore, we've been looking for you." Linda stepped outside, keeping the door open so she could still see her granddaughter inside. "Ruth Henley? What are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, trying to stay alive." Ruth motioned to the riders behind her. "We're all families Crow's debt collection hit. Husband's dead, bank waving forged papers in our faces. 15 families so far, maybe more. Some just disappeared rather than fight." Ethan felt the picture forming. This wasn't about one family. This was a pattern, a racket. Ruth's eyes found him. "And you'd be the man who bought himself a town full of trouble." "Seems that way," Ethan said. Ruth didn't look away from Ethan right away, as if she was measuring him. Then she gave the faintest nod, like she decided he wasn't on the bank's payroll. "We know about the Marshall Crow's bringing," she said. "We also know that Marshall's been taking money from the bank for years. This whole territory's rotten from the ground up." Linda's voice was cautious. "Then what's your plan?" "Evidence," Ruth said simply. "Proof the signatures were forged. We think we know where to get it." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "Samuel Chun. He's a clerk at the bank. He's the one been doing the forgeries. Got himself a conscience last week. Sent word he's willing to testify, but only if we keep him alive long enough to speak." "Where is he?" Ethan asked. "Hiding in the old mining camp, 20 miles north. Crow's men are hunting him. If they find him first," she let the sentence die, but her eyes made it clear what that meant. Linda shook her head. "I can't leave her," she said, nodding toward the store where her granddaughter was coughing again. Her voice softened. "She's too sick to move. That's why we came here," Ruth said. "Some of us will stay, protect this place. The rest will ride for Chun and bring him back before the marshal gets here." It sounded simple, but Ethan could see every hole in it. If they split up, both groups would be weaker. If Crow got a chin first, there'd be no witness. And if the marshal was truly bought and paid for, even evidence might not matter. There's another problem, Ethan said. Even if you prove the debts are fake, what stops them from burning this place down and claiming you resisted arrest? Ruth's mouth curved into a grim smile. Nothing. Which is why we're not just after evidence. We're after witnesses. A lot of them. She pointed toward the horizon. Ethan saw more dust clouds, far off but growing. Word's been spreading. Newspapermen from 3 towns are riding this way. A territorial investigator. Even some tribal leaders from the reservation. We're going to make this so public Crow and his friends can't sweep it away. Linda stared at the approaching dust, almost dazed. You're turning this into a circus. A spectacle, Ruth corrected. One they can't control. Inside, the coughing turned violent. Harsh, hacking bursts that ended in a weak cry. Linda was through the door in seconds. Ethan followed. The girl was sitting upright, her face flushed, eyes glassy. Linda's hands were shaking as she touched the girl's cheek. Something's different. Worse, she said, her voice breaking. Ethan knelt beside the bed and saw it too. Her breathing was shallower, every inhale a struggle. When she coughed, there were tiny flecks of blood on her lips. She needs that doctor, Linda said, almost pleading. She needs him now. And then, as if the moment had been waiting for a cruel twist, another sound came from outside. A single horse at full gallop, its rider pushing it hard. Ethan glanced out the window. Sheriff Crow. Alone. And he was riding like something was chasing him that he couldn't outpace. He slid off his horse, breathless, sweat darkening his shirt. His hands shook as he looked from the gathered families to the horizon where the new riders were still coming. This has gone too far, Crow said. There was no sheriff's swagger in his voice now, just the hollow tone of a man who'd seen something he couldn't fix. Ruth stepped forward, hand resting near her gun. What happened to your marshal? Crow's laugh was bitter. Marshall's dead, shot on the road by Samuel Chun. The words hit hard. Linda froze. Ruth's eyes went wide. You're lying, Ruth said, but there was a crack in her voice. Crow pulled a blood-stained badge from his pocket. Found this near Davidson's body. Chun left a note. Said he'd rather die fighting than hang for forgery. Ethan watched Crow closely. The man wasn't lying about the marshal being dead, but there was something else in his face. Something he wasn't saying. Where's Chun now? Ethan asked. Gone. Took enough evidence to hang half the officials in the territory, including me. Crow's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The admission rippled through the people standing outside. Hands tightened on rifles. No one spoke. Inside the store, the girl's coughing stopped. Too suddenly. Linda was at her side in a heartbeat. Ethan followed and felt the air catch in his chest. She lay limp against the blankets, her skin gray, lips dry. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only white. Blood stained the cloth beneath her head. She's dying. Linda's voice broke, raw and desperate. My baby's dying, and I can't do anything. Ethan pressed his ear to the girl's chest. Her heartbeat was a weak flutter. Every breath seemed like it might be her last. Even if we left right now, he said quietly, she wouldn't survive the 2-day ride to Milford. The room went still except for Linda's uneven breathing. Outside, more hoofbeats approached, the sound of witnesses, newspapers, and investigators arriving. Crow appeared in the doorway, his voice lower than Ethan had ever heard it. There's a doctor in the tribal settlement. Old medicine man. Saves folks the white doctors can't. That's 30 miles through rough country, Ruth said. 2 if you know the right trails, Crow replied. And I know them. Linda looked up from her granddaughter, torn between hope and suspicion. Why would you help us? Crow's eyes shifted to the girl. Because I've got a granddaughter too. And I'm tired of being the kind of man who lets children die for money. Before Linda could answer Crow, gunfire cracked in the distance. Shouts followed, then the heavy thunder of more horses. They're here, Ruth said, moving to the doorway. The bank's hired guns came into the ghost town hard and fast. They expected to find scared families who would give up without a fight. Instead, they met 24 armed settlers, 3 newspapermen with cameras, and a territorial investigator who had been collecting proof of corruption for months. Ethan stepped outside with his rifle in hand. He didn't want to shoot anyone, but he wasn't going to watch these people get dragged away either. The fight didn't last long. The settlers had better ground and more reason to win. When the smoke cleared, half the bank's men were wounded. The rest had thrown down their guns. Their leader, a scar man named Pike, glared at Ethan as he spat blood into the dust. "You don't know what you're messing with. The bank owns this whole territory." "Not anymore," said a thin man walking up with a leather satchel. His name was William, the territorial investigator. He dropped the satchel on a crate and opened it for everyone to see. Inside were stacks of papers, each one marked with signatures, dates, and the bank seal. Samuel Chun didn't kill the marshal. He saved him. Marshal Davidson is alive, resting in the tribal settlement, and he's got enough evidence to close Milford Bank for good. Crow's face went pale. "But the badge, the blood." "Chen's blood," Williams said. "He took a bullet protecting the marshal from the real killers, men working for the bank." The truth hit Crow hard. Ethan could see it in his eyes. The sheriff had been used, a pawn in a game he thought he understood. Linda didn't care about any of that. She was still holding her granddaughter, who was breathing so shallowly it was hard to tell she was alive. "She needs help now," Linda said. Crow looked at the girl, then at his horse. His decision came quick. "I'll take her to the tribal doctor. My horse is fresh, and I know the trails." "I'm coming with you," Linda said instantly. Ethan stepped forward. "So am I." They built a small travois from blankets and poles so the girl could be carried without being jostled too much. As they tied the last knot, Ruth came over holding an official paper. "This came with the investigator," she told Linda. "It says all the forged debts are void. You're free. All of you." The words barely seemed to register. Linda was focused only on her granddaughter's pale face. They set out fast. Crow led them through narrow canyon paths, across cold streams, and over rocky ridges. His knowledge of the land saved them hours. What should have taken a full day took only 6. When they reached the tribal settlement, an elderly man named Joseph Whitehorse met them. He knelt beside the girl, his hands gentle, his eyes calm. "Pneumonia," he said after a moment. But not too late. Linda stayed by her granddaughter's side every minute. Ethan helped where he could, fetching water, splitting wood. Crow spent his time writing a confession, every detail he knew about the bank and the men who'd been pulling the strings. 3 days later, the girl opened her eyes and whispered for water. Linda cried quietly as she held the cup to her lips. The days in the tribal settlement blurred together, each one built around the girl's slow fight back to life. The small lodge where they stayed smelled of cedar smoke and herbs, the air warm from the fire that never went out. Joseph Whitehorse moved with quiet purpose, mixing powders into water, pressing warm cloths to the girl's chest, whispering to her in a language Ethan didn't know. Linda never left her side. Sometimes she would hum soft lullabies, the kind you sing to babies who are too young to understand the words but know the love behind them. Ethan would sit nearby, whittling small bits of wood just to keep his hands busy. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but watching the girl fight for each breath made him feel helpless in a way he hadn't felt since losing his own sister years back. On the second night, Crow sat across the fire from Ethan, his face lit in flickers of orange and shadow. He had a piece of paper on his lap, half filled with his uneven handwriting. "You always been a lawman?" Ethan asked quietly. Crow shook his head. "Was a rancher once. Had a family. When my wife died, I took the badge. Thought I could keep the peace." He looked into the fire for a long moment. "Turns out keeping the peace is different from keeping things fair. I'll let myself forget that." Ethan studied him. "And now I'm writing it all down," Crow said. "Every deal, every forged paper, every time I look the other way. They'll have to lock me up for it, but at least when I walk out again, maybe I'll be the kind of man my granddaughter thinks I am." Neither of them said anything for a while after that. The fire cracked softly, and the girl coughed in her sleep. By the third morning, she was stronger. She could sit up for short moments, even manage a weak smile when Linda brushed her hair. Ethan noticed her eyes had some light back in them. That was the first time he let himself believe she might make it. News from the outside world began to trickle in. Riders brought word that the territorial investigator had used Chen's documents to issue warrants. The bank's president had been arrested. Half the county commissioners were under investigation. Families who'd lost everything were starting to come forward, knowing they weren't alone anymore. But there was still danger. Some of the bank's hired men had vanished rather than surrender. Rumors said they'd gone to ground, waiting for a chance to settle scores. On the fourth day, Joseph Whitehorse pronounced the girl past the worst of it. She will need rest, good food, warmth. But she will live, he said with a small, approving nod. Linda's hands trembled as she thanked him, her voice catching. I thought I was going to bury her, she admitted quietly. Joseph's eyes softened. Now you will watch her grow. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridges, they made the ride back to the ghost town. This time it didn't feel like a ride into an empty place. Ruth was waiting for them, along with other families. They'd started calling it New Haven. The name had caught on fast. Ethan rode in beside Linda's wagon, watching her granddaughter wrapped in blankets, eyes wide as she took in the small crowd gathered to welcome her back. The air was crisp with the smell of fresh bread someone had been baking. For the first time, the town felt alive. The next days were a blur of rebuilding. Families claimed the abandoned buildings, fixing roofs, sweeping out years of dust. Ruth organized supplies, while the investigator made sure every family had legal title to their new homes. Ethan gave away most of the land he'd bought, keeping only enough for a small ranch at the edge of town. Can't ranch on ghosts, he told Ruth with a smile, but you can build something real if you've got the right people. Crow kept his word. He rode into the territorial capital, turned himself in, and served his time. When he came back, it wasn't with a badge someone gave him. It was with one the town asked him to wear. This time, he worked for them, not the bank. Through it all, Ethan noticed something. How quickly people could breathe again when they weren't looking over their shoulder every day. Children started laughing in the streets. The garden Linda had planted behind the store grew twice as big. And the girl, her name was Emily, got strong enough to help carry goods to customers. One evening, Ethan stood in his own small patch of garden, the hills around New Haven glowing gold in the sunset. Emily was chasing chickens, laughing, her voice bright and whole. Linda stood on the store porch, her hands on her hips, smiling like someone who finally believed tomorrow might be better than yesterday. Ethan thought back to the day he'd arrived, with nothing but a deed in his pocket and a plan to make a little money. Instead, he'd found something harder to put a price on, people worth standing for. The first winter in New Haven came early and hard. Snow piled against the doorways. Wind howled through the alleys between the buildings, and the nights could freeze water solid in a bucket before morning. But this time, no one faced it alone. Families shared what they had. When someone's firewood ran low, a neighbor would show up with an armload without being asked. When one roof leaked, half a dozen hands were there before the next snowfall. Even the children pitched in, carrying water, feeding animals, running messages from house to house. Ethan settled into a rhythm. His days were spent tending cattle and hauling supplies for the store. In the evenings, he'd find himself at Linda's table more often than not, eating stew with Emily curled up in a blanket beside the fire. She was still thin, but her cheeks had color again, and she'd started peppering him with questions about horses, about how to ride, about whether he'd teach her come spring. Crow, true to his promise, wore his badge again. But it was different now. He patrolled the streets on foot, stopped to help fix a fence, or shared coffee with the men working on the new schoolhouse. People no longer flinched when they saw him. Some even waved. Ethan figured redemption didn't come easy, but Crow was earning it one small act at a time. One evening, as the snow fell thick outside, Ruth stopped by the store with the latest news from the territorial capital. Milford Bank is gone, she told them, brushing snow from her coat. Sold off in pieces to pay damages to the families they wronged. And the last of the bank's hired guns are either in prison or gone. So far, no one cares to find them. Linda listened quietly, her hands busy mending a shirt. "And Shun?" she asked. "Alive," Ruth said with a faint smile. "Living out west somewhere. Doesn't want to be near any of this again." That night, after Ruth left, Ethan stepped outside for some air. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked to the edge of town. The moon lit the hills silver, and from here, he could see the glow of fires in every building. A town that 6 months ago had been silent was now alive with the sound of laughter, of life. He thought about how easily it could have gone another way. If he'd stepped aside when Crow first showed up, if Ruth's riders hadn't found them, if Emily hadn't survived the ride to the tribal doctor, the whole place might have gone dark again. Another set of lives swallowed by greed and the quiet cruelty of those who thought power meant ownership. The sound of footsteps behind him pulled him from his thoughts. Linda came up beside him, wrapping her shawl tighter. "You're a hard man to find when you want to be," she said with a small smile. "Just thinking," Ethan replied, "about how close we came to losing all this before it even started." Linda followed his gaze to the flickering lights of the town. "We didn't, though, because you stayed when you could have walked away." Ethan shook his head. "Because enough of us stood together when it mattered." For a while, they just stood there in the quiet, the cold air carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. Then Linda said softly, "I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing their home. Now I know it's losing the belief that anyone would fight to help you get it back." Ethan looked at her. "So you believe it now?" She nodded. "I do." The snow was still falling when they headed back toward the store, the windows glowing warm ahead of them. Inside, Emily was at the counter pretending to sell canned peaches to Ruth's youngest boy. Her laugh was the brightest sound in the room. Ethan knew there would still be hard times. Winter was long, and life out here didn't stop testing you just because you'd won one fight. But New Haven wasn't the kind of place that went dark without a fight anymore. Spring came late to New Haven, but when it did, it came fast. Snow melted into clear streams, grass pushed through the thawed earth, and the hills turned the kind of green that only lasts a few weeks before the summer heat comes. Ethan's small ranch was alive with calves finding their legs, and the store bustled from morning until sundown. Linda had hung a new sign above the door, plain letters, hand-painted, Whitmore's General Store. Emily had insisted on painting the little flower in the corner herself, and even though the petals were uneven, Linda left it just as it was. Life still had its share of troubles. A fence broke in the wind. A shipment came late. One of the new families argued over whose cattle had trampled the garden. But these were problems that could be solved with work and words, not with guns, not with fear. One afternoon, Ethan found himself watching Emily ride a small bay mare around the open field beyond the store. She sat straight in the saddle, the way he'd taught her, her hair flying loose in the wind. Linda came up beside him, her hands tucked into her apron pockets. "She's a different child now," Ethan said. "She's alive," Linda replied, her voice warm. "That's enough for me." Crow walked by a moment later, tipping his hat. His face looked older somehow, but lighter too, as if he'd set down a weight he'd been carrying for years. The townsfolk had begun to trust him again, not because of his badge, but because of what he did every day without anyone asking. Later that week, a group of travelers stopped in New Haven. They'd heard rumors of a place where families had fought the bank and won, where neighbors stood together and drove out corruption. One man asked Ethan if it was true. Ethan just smiled and said, "It's true enough if you're willing to make it true where you are." That night, the town gathered for the first time without fear hanging over them. Tables were set out in the street, lanterns strung between buildings, the air full of music from a fiddle someone had brought. Kids ran between the legs of their parents, chasing each other until they fell laughing into the dust. When Ethan looked around, he realized something. This wasn't the same ghost town he'd bought for $100. The old buildings might still stand in the same place, but what filled them now was worth more than money could ever measure. He thought about all the small decisions that had brought them here, moments where it would have been easier to look away, to tell himself it wasn't his problem, and how each time, choosing to stay had been the harder thing, the better thing. As the sun set behind the hills, he found himself telling Emily, "You know, people like to think a town is just buildings and fences. But it's not. It's people who look out for each other. That's what makes a place worth living in. And that's what keeps it alive." She tilted her head. "Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard," he said. The fiddle played on, the lantern swayed in the warm breeze, And for the first time since he'd ridden into this place, Ethan felt like he wasn't passing through anymore. He belonged. And maybe that was the real lesson, that sometimes you don't choose the people you fight for. They just show up one day, needing someone to stand beside them. And when you do, you might just find that in saving them, you end up saving yourself too.